More power to them. To some extent, every country has to deal with an elderly population. There are differences, though, in how to approach it. China puts more responsibility on the family, other countries on the government. I spoke about different approaches with Ronald Lee. He's a professor at the University of California at Berkeley.
There are basically three ways to provide for old age. One is through the family, as is done, as you mentioned, in China to a considerable degree. Another is through the government, through the public sector, through public pensions and public health care. And the third is through individuals saving during their working years and then consuming and paying for health care and so on out of their accumulated assets. Those are the three strategies.
Let me ask you about the data that we've looked at. We looked at the world's top 5 economies, put together this graphic. In the United States, 14% of the population is 65 or older. In China, it's 9%. But in Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom, it's between 18% and 25%. Now, that's part of the population that's over 65. So how does caring for an older population impact a country's economy?
Well, it has a very important impact. Now, when the elderly rely heavily on assets, it doesn't matter that much if there's a higher proportion of elderly. But when the elderly are relying on, let's say, public pension systems, as in Europe, Japan, really all the rich industrial countries, virtually all of them, then population aging means that either benefit levels have to be cut or taxes have to be raised. And it's a very serious problem because taxes are already very high in Europe and in these other countries. China and other East Asian countries have relatively small public pension programs. So that effect of population aging is smaller. Their populations are aging rapidly, but their public pension programs are relatively modest. On the other hand, because the family is important, those pressures that would have been on the public pensions are now on the families.
I see. Well, let's go back to the same graphic we showed just a moment ago. It shows the age distributions across these 5 big economies. Is there an ideal breakdown for a country's age distribution? I guess you can't get it, but if there was, what would it be?
In the short and medium term, you want to have and you can have a very high proportion in the working ages with relatively few children and relatively few elderly. That's the so-called demographic dividend period or the window of opportunity period. But that's not sustainable demographically. If there are few children today, there'll be few workers tomorrow, and the proportion of elderly will rise. And that's where China is, just on the cusp where the ratio of workers to the population is going to begin to decline. Now, so that's in the short and medium term, but in the long term, in a sustainable way, you want a proper balance of young and elderly. And I and my collaborators found that for China, that best balance would be with a fertility level that's not too different from what China has now. That is something like 1.6, 1.7 births per woman. But that's a real issue, I think, in China, and it will be even more so as the population ages, addressing labor supply of older people at older ages, that in relation to age at retirement and so on.
What should be the retirement age?
Well, I think it has to go up to 70 in the rich industrial, low mortality, relatively low fertility countries. That said, raising the retirement age isn't enough because it's not just that people are living longer, it's also that fertility is lower, and so there are fewer workers relative to the elderly, and that requires other additional adjustments.
Yeah, it's a mix, there's no doubt about it. Ron Lee joining us from Berkeley, California. Thanks so much.
Thanks for talking to me.